A black bride walked into her wedding, radiant and ready to start the next chapter of her life. She had everything: a breathtaking venue draped in white florals and golden accents, the man she loved waiting for her at the altar, friends and family gathered to celebrate their union. But none of that could mask the truth brewing in the front row. There, sitting still and cold like marble statues, were the people who never wanted her there, her groom's parents. They smiled, yes, but only for appearances. Behind their carefully arranged faces was a wall of quiet hostility. And what happened when the bride took the microphone later that evening? It left the entire room stunned, and changed everything in just 7 minutes. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, comment below and tell us, where in the world are you watching from today? And if this story moves you even just a little, don't forget to share it with someone who needs to hear it. It was a clear afternoon, the kind that poets write about and photographers chase. The sun poured gently over the manicured lawns of the Whitmore estate, where Ayanna and Daniel were getting married. The venue was nothing short of regal, a garden pavilion adorned with ivory roses, soft blush peonies, and flowing white drapery that swayed lightly in the breeze. Beneath the floral arch stood Daniel, tall in his navy blue tuxedo, his blue eyes fixed on the aisle. He looked like the picture of calm to most people, but Ayanna knew him better than that. She recognized the subtle twitch of his fingers and the slight tension in his jaw. He wasn't worried about the vows nor the crowd. He was worried about his parents. Seated in the front row, Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore looked like they had stepped out of a lifestyle magazine. Elegant, refined, utterly composed. But their posture told another story. Mrs. Whitmore clutched her clutch so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Her husband sat next to her, arms crossed, lips drawn into a line so sharp it could cut glass. Their eyes flicked toward the entrance, waiting for Ayanna to appear, each glance loaded with disapproval that no amount of decorum could disguise. Back in the bridal suite, Ayanna stood in front of a full-length mirror, taking one last breath before the walk. Her wedding gown flowed like water, simple and elegant, hugging her figure just enough to show her strength. Her skin glowed under the soft lights, and her dark curls were pinned just enough to let a few wisps fall gently along her cheeks. Her father stood beside her, already misty-eyed, ready to walk his only daughter down the aisle. But Ayanna's focus wasn't on the moment's beauty. It was on what waited for her at the end of that walk, and what lingered in the front row. She had tried. Lord knows she had tried. In the year leading up to the wedding, Ayanna had done everything she could to gain their acceptance. She attended their galas, smiled through backhanded compliments, sent handwritten thank you notes after every awkward dinner. She had swallowed comments like, "Oh, I just assumed Daniel would end up with someone more like us. And you're very articulate, Ayanna. Such a pleasant surprise." And every time, she told herself it didn't matter. What mattered was Daniel, their love, their shared future. But deep down, a quiet ache had started to grow. Because no matter how kind, accomplished, or dignified she was, she always remained the outsider in their eyes. She wasn't the daughter-in-law they'd imagined, and no amount of good intention could disguise the real reason why. She was black. And that, to the Whitmores, was a line drawn in permanent ink. The music changed, soft, classical, reverent. Ayanna stepped forward, bouquet in hand, her father steadying her arm. She walked slowly, deliberately, each step measured, each breath drawn with grace. Guests turned to watch, some in awe of her beauty, others whispering about the cold stares from the front row. From behind his camera, the wedding videographer caught everything. The tension in the air, the steel in Ayanna's eyes, the quiet defiance in her smile. When her eyes met Daniel's, everything else fell away. He was her safe place. The man who had once stood up to his own parents at a family dinner and said, "I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you who I've chosen." The man who had held her when she cried after being mistaken for a server at his parents' anniversary party. The man who even now looked at her like she was his whole world. And still, his eyes begged for her strength. Because he too could feel the judgment pressing down on them like a second atmosphere. She reached the altar, smiling through the weight of 1,000 unspoken slights. Daniel took her hand gently, giving it a slight squeeze. "I'm with you," it said without words. But even in that sacred space, even as vows were minutes away, the hostility in the air lingered like the sharp scent of ozone before a storm. Mrs. Whitmore leaned toward her husband, her whisper barely audible but laced with venom. "I still can't believe he's going through with this." Ayanna heard it. She wasn't supposed to, but she did. A part of her recoiled, her stomach clenching involuntarily. Not because it was new, she had heard worse, but because it was her wedding day. Of all days, she could have let it break her. She could have turned away, let tears smudge her perfectly lined eyes, let anger twist her expression into something bitter. But she didn't. Ayanna took a breath, long and slow, and let the tension wash through her without taking root. Not today. Not here. She lifted her chin, straightened her spine, and looked forward. The ceremony began. As the officiant spoke, Ayanna stood with the kind of stillness that only comes from years of learning how to take up space without making people uncomfortable. She had been taught that silence was safety, that dignity was resistance. But something inside her had shifted. Because she had also learned, through a lifetime of microaggressions, exclusion, and quiet stings, that silence can sometimes be mistaken for acceptance. And she was done being misunderstood. There was something brewing inside her, something planned, something she had kept to herself, even from Daniel. And while the ceremony moved on and guests smiled at readings and laughs were shared during vows, Ayanna held on to a secret. One that would flip this day on its head before the night was over. Because she wasn't just going to marry the man she loved. She was going to reclaim her place in the story. And when she did, the very people who thought they could quietly erase her would find themselves written out of the ending they thought they controlled. But that part of the story comes later. Right now she stands beside Daniel, under an arch of roses and silk, and tells him with her eyes what words cannot say. You and me, we belong. Even if they never say it. Even if they never believe it. We do. She places her hand in his. The officiant begins the next part of the ceremony. And just beyond the edge of everyone's gaze, Mrs. Whitmore adjusts the pearl necklace on her collarbone, her lips tight, her mind already planning what she will say to save face at the reception. But she doesn't know what's coming. And when the moment arrives, when Ayanna steps up to speak, none of them will be ready. Are you? She was always the kind of woman who noticed what others tried to hide. The half-second flick of a judgmental glance, the polite but distant handshake, the subtle pauses in conversations when she walked into a room. Ayanna had learned to see these things from a young age, not because she was looking for them, but because they always found her. Long before Daniel, before medical school, before she could even define the word microaggression, she already understood what it meant to feel both invisible and too visible at the same time. And when she fell in love with a man like Daniel Whitmore, blonde, blue-eyed, and born into old money, she knew what she was walking into. But knowing it didn't make it easier. The first time she met Daniel's parents, it was at a charity brunch in uptown Manhattan. She had chosen her outfit carefully. Professional yet feminine, minimal jewelry, subtle makeup. She even researched the nonprofit they supported so she could hold a meaningful conversation. She thought that if she came prepared, kind, and open, it would be enough. Daniel had told her not to worry. They can be formal, but once they get to know you, he had said, trailing off like someone who wasn't entirely sure of his own words. She had smiled and nodded, not because she believed him, but because she wanted to. The brunch had been elegant, pristine, and utterly cold. Mrs. Whitmore had extended a hand without rising from her seat. Her tone had been measured, her smile mechanical. You must be the doctor, she had said, like Ayanna was a business partner being reviewed, not the woman her son loved. Mr. Whitmore had offered a stiff nod before launching into a conversation with the man seated next to him, effectively dismissing her presence. Ayanna had spent the rest of that morning carefully navigating conversations, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, and ignoring the way other guests looked her over like a curiosity. Later that evening, when she and Daniel walked through Central Park hand in hand, he asked, "So what did you think?" Ayanna hesitated. Part of her wanted to protect him, to keep the moment light. But the other part, the part that had walked out of that brunch with a familiar ache in her chest, couldn't stay silent. "They don't like me," she said plainly. Daniel squeezed her hand. "They just don't know you yet," he replied. But even then, he didn't look her in the eyes when he said it. Over the following months, Ayanna made every effort to bridge the gap. She invited them to dinners, brought thoughtful gifts, asked questions about their childhoods, their favorite wines, their traditions. She attended Daniel's cousin's wedding where she sat through speeches laced with subtle nostalgia for old America and endured relatives who assumed she was staff. She never said a word. She never caused a scene. Because she knew what would happen if she did. She'd be labeled angry. Difficult. A problem. She tried harder. She organized a small dinner party, inviting Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore to her apartment, a modern space she took pride in, with bookshelves full of medical journals and African American literature, a kitchen where she had prepared every dish herself. It was intimate, cozy, candlelit. She wore a soft cream blouse, kept the jazz playing low in the background, and even opened a bottle of Bordeaux she'd been saving for a special occasion. They arrived on time, coats still smelling faintly of expensive cologne and disdain. Mrs. Whitmore looked around and smiled thinly. "Very charming," she said, letting her fingers brush the edge of a carved wooden sculpture Ayana had brought back from Ghana. She didn't ask about it. She didn't ask about anything. During dinner, the conversation circled around finance, board memberships, and vacation homes. When Ayana tried to steer it towards social medicine or underfunded clinics, the interest in the room plummeted. At one point, Mr. Whitmore chuckled and said, "I suppose it's noble, all that community outreach. But don't you think it's a bit utopian?" Ayana smiled, her fork paused midair. "Not at all. I think it's necessary." Daniel, bless him, jumped in and tried to mediate. "Ayana runs a clinic that serves over 1,500 families a year. It's not utopian. It's effective." But the tension had already crept in. It was like smoke in the air, unseen, but impossible to ignore. By the time they left that evening, Mrs. Whitmore offered a single sentence that Ayana would never forget. "You've certainly made a lovely home for yourself." Her voice held no warmth, no acknowledgement of the effort, the culture, the pride woven into every inch of that space. Ayana watched them walk away from the building's marble foyer, feeling the weight of the unspoken once again. "You don't belong in our world. But we'll pretend, for Daniel's sake." She had cried that night, not out of weakness, but out of frustration. Not because she needed their approval, but because she was tired of chasing it. She was tired of editing herself, of shrinking, of calculating every sentence. And Daniel had held her, apologizing over and over, as if it was his burden to fix. But it wasn't, because this wasn't about one bad dinner or one cold remark. This was about history, legacy, the quiet, systemic ways people like his parents protected their version of the world by excluding everyone else from it. Still, Ayana didn't give up. She invited Daniel's mother to lunch, just the two of them. She reserved a corner table at a French bistro, wore a pale pink dress, and arrived early with flowers in hand. Mrs. Whitmore showed up 15 minutes late and declined the wine. Their conversation was civil but empty, like two diplomats from opposing nations forced into small talk. When Ayana spoke about her upbringing, her goals, the health equity program she was building, Mrs. Whitmore nodded, but offered nothing in return. Not a single question about Ayana's family. Not a single compliment about her work. Halfway through the meal, Ayana asked gently, "I know this may be forward, but I just want to understand. What exactly concerns you about me being with Daniel?" Mrs. Whitmore's eyes flicked up. For a brief second, Ayana saw something raw pass through them, fear maybe, or control slipping. But then it vanished, replaced by the polished facade. "It's not about concern," she said calmly. "It's about compatibility. Daniel was raised in a certain environment. He has responsibilities, expectations, and sometimes love just isn't enough." Ayana's breath caught. There it was, the truth behind all the pleasant lies. Love isn't enough, because love, in their eyes, could never bridge the gap between their kind and hers. She finished the lunch without flinching, paid the bill herself, and walked out with her head held high. But something inside her changed that day. She stopped trying to fit. She started planning. It began quietly. Late at night, she would sit at her desk and scribble notes. Ideas turned into blueprints. Conversations turned into commitments. She didn't tell Daniel. Not because she didn't trust him, but because this plan wasn't about defending her worth to anyone. It was about reclaiming it. She had spent so long trying to be accepted into the Whitmore family. But what if she built something that made acceptance irrelevant? What if she didn't just marry into their legacy, but rewrote it? Ayana was done playing by their rules. She was about to change everything. The first time Ayana saw the house Daniel grew up in, she thought it looked like something out of a magazine cover. A pristine colonial estate with ivy crawling tastefully up the stone facade, and a front lawn trimmed, so evenly it looked like velvet. She remembered standing on the cobblestone driveway, clutching a bottle of wine and a lemon tart she'd baked from scratch, her stomach twisted into a dozen nervous knots. She had asked Daniel a dozen times, "Are you sure they're ready to meet me?" And each time he said yes. But the look in his eyes always faltered just a fraction of a second too long. Inside, the house was eerily silent when they entered. No laughter, no scent of food wafting through the air. Just polished floors and a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. A house with everything money could buy, and none of the warmth that made a place feel like home. Mrs. Whitmore had greeted her in a silk blouse and diamonds, lips painted a muted coral, not a hair out of place. "Ayana," she said with a thin smile, pronouncing it with a hesitance that made it sound foreign, like a word she didn't trust on her tongue. "You're very punctual." Mr. Whitmore didn't say much beyond a firm handshake and a distracted glance toward the stock ticker running silently on the wall-mounted television in his study. That evening had unfolded like a meticulously directed play. Every conversation was surface level, every gesture measured. Ayana had tried to talk about the art pieces on the wall, the travel books on the coffee table, even complimented the landscaping. But every effort was returned with a polite nod, as if she were a guest who had stayed just a bit too long. She remembered the dinner vividly. It was salmon with beurre blanc, roasted fingerling potatoes, and asparagus stalks that stood like soldiers on each plate. Mrs. Whitmore served it herself, though Ayana suspected it was catered. As they sat around the grand dining table, Mr. Whitmore casually asked, "So, how did you two meet?" And Ayana began to tell the story of how she and Daniel had met at a health equity conference in Chicago. She described the moment they locked eyes during a Q&A, how Daniel had approached her afterward with questions about her work in underserved communities. "It wasn't exactly romantic," she said with a small laugh, "but it was real." Silence followed. Then Mrs. Whitmore picked up her wine glass and asked, "Is that where you were raised?" "In Chicago." Ayana paused. "No, I grew up in Baltimore. Inner city, actually. My mom was a nurse. My dad worked maintenance for the school district." Another pause. A flicker of something across Mrs. Whitmore's face. Curiosity? Disdain? Ayana couldn't tell. "Well," Mr. Whitmore said, cutting into his fish, "it sounds like you've worked very hard for what you have." "That's admirable." Ayana had smiled, even though something about the word admirable grated on her. Like it was meant to be a compliment, but wrapped in a kind of surprise that she'd even made it to their table. After that night, Ayana stopped asking to visit. She saw Daniel's parents only on formal occasions, weddings, holidays, family gatherings, and always as a formality. They never visited her place again. She noticed how Mrs. Whitmore avoided physical contact. How she always managed to compliment Ayana's outfits without ever using the word beautiful. How every conversation, no matter how trivial, felt like it was being graded silently on a scale no one ever explained to her. So, Ayana stopped performing. She focused on her work. She poured herself into the clinic she co-founded with two colleagues from med school, a free health center serving low-income families in East Harlem. She led campaigns to provide maternal care to undocumented women, lobbied for city grants, and organized night shifts to ensure single parents could bring their children in after work hours. She became a name, then a face, and finally a voice people started to listen to. Her clinic was featured in the local paper. She gave interviews. She spoke at conferences. And still, when Daniel's mother saw her at a cousin's wedding one spring, she said, "I heard your little project is getting some attention. That must be exciting for you." Like Ayana had started a book club or a craft blog, not a life-saving community hub. Daniel had tried to smooth things over, of course. He defended Ayana behind closed doors, challenged his parents when they pushed too far, and once nearly walked out of a family brunch when his uncle referred to Ayana's clinic as an inner-city charity case. But Ayana knew that even his love had limits, lines he hadn't yet dared to cross. She never blamed him. Not really. He had grown up in a world where confrontation was considered vulgar and silence was a virtue. He had never been forced to fight for a seat at the table. But Ayana had. And one night, long after another uncomfortable dinner with the Whitmores, she sat across from Daniel in their apartment, her fingers wrapped around a mug of mint tea. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "if your parents will ever see me as more than a compromise?" Daniel looked up from his laptop, startled by the question. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she traced the rim of her mug with one finger. "I mean, if I didn't have the degrees, if I wasn't a doctor, if I didn't know which fork to use at your galas, or how to pronounce Bordeaux like I was born drinking it, would I still be good enough?" Daniel set the laptop aside. "Ayana, this isn't about you not being good enough. It's about them not being good enough to see who you really are." She looked at him then, deeply, searching his face for the boy she'd fallen in love with in that Chicago auditorium. The one who believed in justice, in equity, in love that didn't ask for credentials. "I don't need their validation," she said softly. "But I'm tired of pretending it doesn't sting." He reached across the table and took her hand, kissed it gently. "Then let's stop pretending." It was after that night that she started planning the scholarship fund. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about proving them wrong. It was about redirecting her pain into something greater. A legacy that had her name on it. Yes, but that carried theirs too. She wanted to take the very pedestal they guarded so carefully, the name they polished like silverware, and use it to lift someone else up. Someone who looked like her. Someone who came from where she came from. She started small, one meeting with a philanthropic advisor, then another with a lawyer. She worked on the paperwork during lunch breaks, reached out to alumni from her undergrad for initial funding, and used every ounce of her network to build momentum. She never mentioned it to Daniel. Not because she didn't trust him, but because she wanted to stand on that stage, mic in hand, and let them all see her, not as someone begging for a seat, but as the architect of the entire damn building. As the wedding day approached, people fussed over flowers and guest lists, over napkin colors and string quartets. But Ayanna had her eyes set on something much bigger, something transformative. And every time she saw Mrs. Whitmore smile her rehearsed smile, or overheard Mr. Whitmore say, "Well, at least she's not trying to change his last name," she smiled back. Not out of submission, but anticipation. Because they didn't know what was coming. But they would. The morning of the wedding began with a strange stillness, as if the world had momentarily paused to take a breath. Ayanna woke before the sun rose, her eyes opening to a soft golden light that filtered through the hotel suite's linen curtains. She lay there, unmoving, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside, the distant honk of a car horn, the low rumble of traffic starting to swell with the day. It was her wedding day. And despite all the anticipation, the countless fittings, the countless more emotional conversations, she felt calm. Almost eerily so. The suite was silent. Her bridesmaids had not yet arrived. Her phone was on silent across the room. There were no last-minute texts, no frantic calls. Just her breath, slow and steady, and the knowledge that in a few hours, she would walk down the aisle and change her life forever. But even in the stillness, the weight of what waited outside the door pressed in around her. She slipped out of bed and walked barefoot to the window. Below her, the lake shimmered beneath a waking sun, the garden pavilion already beginning to buzz with early arriving florists and coordinators. She could see the white chairs being aligned, could spot the long aisle cloth being unfurled by two men in tuxedos. It was beautiful, stunning, even, and yet she knew that beauty could only hide so much. Because today was never going to be just about flowers and vows. Today would be a test. She made her way to the bathroom and stared at her reflection. Her face was bare, fresh. She studied herself not with criticism, but with clarity. The woman in the mirror was no longer the same person who had once rehearsed polite answers at brunches with the Whitmores. She was no longer trying to fit into anyone's image of what a bride, or a black woman, should be. She had spent too long making herself smaller, sanding her edges to fit into a mold that was never made for her. Today that ended. When her bridesmaids arrived an hour later, the room filled with music, laughter, and perfume. The makeup artist arrived. The hairstylist too. They fluttered around her like a swarm of supportive butterflies, painting and curling and pinning her into a vision of grace. But even as she smiled and thanked them, Ayanna's mind was elsewhere. She had brought the final paperwork with her, tucked neatly inside her travel case, inside a leather folio. The scholarship fund's name was embossed in gold on the top of the folder, the Whitmore Initiative for Opportunity. The irony made her lips twitch. She hadn't told anyone, not her friends, not her maid of honor, not even Daniel. It was her secret, her power, her statement, and the moment to unveil it would come later. But before that, she had to walk through fire. The ceremony began as any ceremony should, graceful, emotional, carefully choreographed. The guests murmured in appreciation of the white floral arch, the live violinist playing a string version of John Legend's All of Me, the flower girls trailing rose petals with precise little fingers. Ayanna stood behind the draped curtain, her hand resting lightly on her father's arm. "Are you ready, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice low and steady, though his eyes were damp. She nodded. "I've never been more ready." But even as the music swelled and the curtains parted and all heads turned, Ayanna's heart beat not just with joy, but with resolve. Each step down that aisle was deliberate, measured, powerful. From the corner of her eye, she saw Mrs. Whitmore in the front row, spine straight, pearls gleaming at her throat. Her expression was unreadable, somewhere between polite neutrality and quiet protest. Mr. Whitmore sat beside her, arms crossed, eyes fixed on a distant point above the altar. Neither of them smiled. Neither of them clapped. It was as if the moment was happening in another reality they refused to acknowledge. Ayanna didn't break eye contact with Daniel as she approached. He looked at her with awe, his blue eyes glassy, his lips trembling into a smile that held more gratitude than any words ever could. She reached him, took his hands, and together they faced the officiant. The ceremony was beautiful. The vows were heartfelt, but Ayanna was only half present, because something had shifted just minutes before the ceremony. A detail she hadn't shared with anyone. She had overheard something. As she was walking down the hallway from the bridal suite to the garden, her bouquet trembling slightly in her hand, she had paused near the entrance arch to gather herself. And there, unintentionally, unavoidably, she had heard voices. Mrs. Whitmore. Her unmistakable tone. Clipped, tight, venom behind silk. I still can't believe he's doing this. A public spectacle. What will people think? Mr. Whitmore's response was barely a murmur. It's too late now. Mrs. Whitmore. There's still time to talk to him. Pull him aside. Daniel always listens to you. Ayanna had frozen. Her breath caught. Her father had gently touched her elbow, but she'd shaken her head quietly and listened just a few seconds longer. She doesn't belong in this world, Charles, Mrs. Whitmore had whispered, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. I don't care how accomplished she is. Some things just don't change. Those words should have broken her. They should have shattered the illusion of peace, of grace, of the sacredness of this moment. But instead, something in Ayanna clicked. She stepped into her ceremony not wounded, but armed. By the time the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Ayanna's mind was already racing, not with anger but with clarity. And during the applause, the kiss, the cheerful recessional, she felt as if she were walking a razor's edge. Not because she feared the moment, but because she was about to light a fire under everything that had tried to dim her light. At the reception, she let the night play out as expected. First dances, speeches, laughter, champagne, the warm glow of candles, and the clinking of cutlery. She moved gracefully through the room, thanking guests, posing for photos, accepting compliments. And all the while, the Whitmores watched her. Like hawks, waiting, perhaps, for a misstep, a sign of weakness, an uncouth joke, a mistake to validate every whispered objection they'd ever uttered in private. But Ayanna gave them none. She was elegance incarnate, poised, radiant, the kind of presence that couldn't be diminished no matter how many icy stares were cast her way. Until finally the time came. The master of ceremonies called for speeches. Daniel spoke first, tenderly, beautifully. He spoke of falling in love with Ayanna, of the woman who challenged and inspired him, who opened his eyes to injustice, to humility, to real love. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Then it was Ayanna's turn. She rose from her seat with a smile and took the microphone. I wasn't planning on speaking tonight, she began, her voice clear, warm, calm. But some moments asked to be claimed. The room hushed. Mr. Whitmore leaned slightly forward. Mrs. Whitmore's posture didn't change, but her lips pressed tightly together. Ayanna smiled. I know that not everyone in this room has supported our union, she said, pausing just enough to let the words land. And I understand. Change is uncomfortable. It challenges the stories we've told ourselves, about love, about tradition, about worthiness. There were murmurs in the crowd, shifts in seats. But love, she continued, love doesn't seek permission. It simply exists, fully, unapologetically. And with that, she opened the leather folio and laid it gently on the podium. I'd like to share something with you all. Over the past year, I've been working on a project, a scholarship fund, in the Whitmore family name, created to give students from underrepresented backgrounds the opportunity to pursue careers in medicine, law, and public service. Gasps rippled through the hall. Eyes widened. Even Daniel looked stunned. I did this not because I needed to be accepted, but because I believe in using every name, every legacy to lift others, even if that name never wanted me. And then she looked straight into Mrs. Whitmore's eyes. There's power in grace, she said softly, but don't mistake grace for silence. And she stepped down, leaving the room in stunned, absolute, breathless silence. For a moment, no one moved. The echo of Ayanna's last sentence hung in the air like a hymn, vibrating through the grand ballroom as if the chandeliers themselves had paused to listen. Some clutched their champagne glasses mid-sip, others leaned forward in their seats, trying to make sense of what had just unfolded. Daniel sat motionless, his eyes locked on Ayanna as though he were seeing her for the first time, all over again. But it was Mrs. Whitmore who seemed to absorb the weight of it most. Her fingers trembled slightly around the stem of her glass. Her eyes didn't flicker toward anyone else. She didn't scan the room to see who had heard, or gauge how embarrassed she ought to feel. No. Her gaze was fixed directly on Ayana, as though trying to reconcile the woman before her with the one she had created in her mind. The outsider, the intruder, the mistake. Ayana stepped away from the podium with the poise of someone who had just closed a courtroom argument or delivered the final thesis of her life. She didn't glance toward the crowd. She didn't wait for validation. She returned to her seat, back straight, chin lifted, not in defiance, but in clarity. Her message hadn't been designed to punish. It had been crafted to reveal. Not a call-out, a calling forth. The MC hesitated for a beat before stepping back into the spotlight, clearly unsure whether to follow that with the planned slideshow of childhood photos and first date montages. But Daniel rose from his chair before anyone could fill the silence. He didn't go to the podium. He didn't need to. Instead, he turned toward the crowd, his voice steady but carrying enough force to draw every pair of eyes in the room. "There's nothing I can add to what Ayana just said," he began, his hand resting gently on the back of her chair. "But I will say this. I've never been prouder of anyone in my entire life. And if you don't see why, maybe you're not supposed to be here tonight." A collective murmur of agreement rolled through the room. Someone clapped, then another, and another, until suddenly, the hall erupted into a storm of applause that seemed to rise and swell like a crashing wave. Guests stood. Friends who had stayed silent when the whispers began now shouted her name. Strangers with mist in their eyes turned to each other, shaking their heads in wonder. But none of it mattered to the people in the front row. Mr. Whitmore had remained stone-faced until now, but even he could not disguise the faint redness creeping up the side of his neck. He adjusted his tie, shifted in his chair, and for the first time that evening, looked over at his wife with something like helplessness. Mrs. Whitmore's expression, however, was harder to read. She had stopped blinking. She wasn't clapping. She wasn't frowning either. She looked like a woman whose entire worldview had been tilted sideways, and she was still deciding whether to fight gravity or surrender to it. Then came the fallout. As the applause slowly ebbed and the evening's momentum shifted back to music and mingling, people approached Ayana, not with forced smiles or polite niceties, but with sincerity. Real, open gratitude. One of Daniel's cousins, a lawyer from Boston who had kept her distance earlier, hugged Ayana so tightly she nearly dropped her clutch. A dean from a medical college offered to match the scholarship donation. A family friend whispered, "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen at a wedding." Daniel stood beside her the entire time, not as her shield but as her anchor. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to explain her or soften her message. He let her be her. Fully. Publicly. Proudly. But the real moment came later, after the cake had been cut and the first dance had played out in front of tearful friends and awestruck onlookers. Ayana had just stepped away for a breath of air when she saw her. Mrs. Whitmore stood near the back exit, half shadowed by a marble pillar and the soft uplighting from the garden pathway. She looked out of place there, removed from the curated elegance of the ballroom. Her arms were crossed, her lips pressed together, but not in that tight-lipped disapproval Ayana had grown used to. There was something softer there now, something worn down. Ayana hesitated, but not for long. She approached. There was no audience now. No performance. No microphone. Just the two of them. "I didn't mean to humiliate you," Ayana said softly, folding her hands in front of her. Mrs. Whitmore didn't respond right away. She kept her gaze on the garden, the way the string lights curled like vines around the hedges. "No," she finally said. "But you did." Ayana nodded. Sometimes truth feels like that. A silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sound of a slow song drifting through the open doors behind them. "I never expected this," Mrs. Whitmore admitted, her voice surprisingly even. "You could have retaliated. You could have exposed us, made a scene. Instead, you gave something beautiful." Ayana didn't reply. She didn't need to. Mrs. Whitmore turned to her, really looked at her. Not as a box to be checked off, not as a mistake to be corrected, but as a woman. A whole, extraordinary woman. "I don't know if I can undo the harm I've done," she said, her voice almost cracking. "I don't expect you to forgive me. But I need you to know, I see you now." Ayana's breath caught slightly. She had not come here tonight seeking reconciliation. She had come with purpose, yes, but not expectation. And somehow, the absence of expectation made this moment feel real. "I'm not asking you to accept me," she said gently. "I just need you to understand that I don't need your permission to exist." Mrs. Whitmore blinked. Once. Twice. And then she did something Ayanna didn't expect. She reached out. It was small. A hand on her arm. A touch. But it was something. I want to help with the scholarship, she said quietly. Ayanna looked at her for a long moment. Because you feel guilty? Because, Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice low, I don't want to be the kind of person who only learns to love after losing the chance. Ayanna said nothing. She simply nodded once. It was a start. Inside, the music had changed. Laughter filled the hall again. Daniel stood near the dance floor, searching for her with his eyes. When he spotted her, a slow smile spread across his face. Ayanna turned back to Mrs. Whitmore. Come inside, she said. It's still your son's wedding too. For the first time that night, Mrs. Whitmore looked human. A little lost. A little relieved. And with a deep breath, she followed Ayanna inside. Not as an adversary. Not as a defeated matriarch. But as a woman slowly learning how to change. Because sometimes, the people who walk into a room convinced they're right, walk out realizing they were just afraid. And sometimes, the most unexpected lesson doesn't come from power or tradition. It comes from grace. And courage. And one woman with a microphone and a truth that refused to be quiet. The reception carried on, but the atmosphere had shifted into something almost electric. It wasn't just a celebration anymore. It was a reckoning, a kind of beautiful undoing. The air was richer, somehow heavier with meaning, as though the collective heartbeat of the room had synchronized to something deeper, more human. People didn't just see a wedding anymore. They saw a moment. They felt it folding around them, urging them to reconsider what they knew, what they believed, and perhaps most importantly, who they were becoming in the presence of it. Ayanna stood by the edge of the dance floor, her heels briefly forgotten as she sank her bare feet into the soft rug, feeling the ground beneath her, centering herself after what had just happened. She could feel the echo of her own voice still vibrating in her chest, not out of nerves, but from the truth that had finally been spoken aloud. She felt both lighter and heavier at once, freed from the years she'd spent biting her tongue, but also fully aware that words like hers carried ripples far beyond the moment they're released. Guests came and went, offering kind words, compliments, genuine questions about the scholarship fund. A few shared personal stories, about their own parents, their own marriages, even their own regrets. Ayanna received them all with grace, listening intently, offering smiles, nods, sometimes even hugs. But beneath the poise, there was still a quiet, trembling anticipation. She hadn't yet spoken with Daniel's father. He had been quiet since the announcement. Not hostile, not aloof, just quiet. Observing. Processing. He had clapped. Ayanna had noticed that. Slowly. Reluctantly. But he had clapped. And in a room like this, where everything was a performance, even a small gesture meant something. She spotted him now across the room, standing beside a column with a half-full whiskey glass in hand. He wasn't talking to anyone. Just standing there, watching her. His expression unreadable as always. Ayanna took a breath. Then another. And walked toward him. He didn't move when she approached. Didn't straighten his shoulders or adjust his tie. He just looked at her as she stopped a few feet away. I assume, he said finally, you planned that moment for a while. Yes, she replied, her voice even. I did. He nodded slowly. It was effective. That wasn't the goal, she said. But I knew it would be heard. And I needed to be heard. There was silence between them again. Not hostile, not warm. Just silence. The kind that comes between two people who have finally acknowledged the elephant in the room, but aren't sure what to do with it. You embarrassed us, he said, eyes still fixed on his glass. Ayanna tilted her head slightly. Or maybe I revealed you. His jaw tightened. Then slowly he nodded again. Fair. She could see it now, not anger, not arrogance, but something that resembled discomfort. The kind of discomfort that doesn't come from being attacked, but from being forced to face oneself. The most dangerous kind. And also the most transformative. My father never would have allowed what happened tonight, he said after a pause. Back in his time, there were boundaries. Rules. You didn't challenge people like that. Not in public. And where did those rules get you? Ayanna asked quietly. What have they preserved? Except silence, shame, and generations of fear dressed up as tradition. He didn't answer. But he didn't deny it either. I used to think respect meant quiet, Ayanna continued. Polish. Restraint. But I've learned that sometimes respect means telling the truth, even when it shakes the room. He turned to look at her then, really look at her. And Daniel? He knew nothing about the fund. No, she said. He didn't. I wanted it to be a surprise. For both of you. Why name it after us? Because I knew you wouldn't, she said simply. And because whether you like it or not, your name carries weight. Influence. Doors open for the name Whitmore, even if they close for mine. I wanted to turn that door into an entrance for someone who needs it. There was another pause. Then he looked away, exhaling slowly, the weight of something cracking in his shoulders. I've spent my life believing in legacy, he murmured. Believing that legacy meant preserving something. A name, a standard, a lineage. But maybe it's about creating something instead. Ayanna said nothing. She let his words sit there, unfold on their own. Then quietly, almost reluctantly, he added, Your mother and father, what do they think of all this? She smiled gently. They think Daniel is lucky. That made him pause. And then, unexpectedly, a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I suppose he is, he said. Ayanna didn't wait for more. She gave a small, respectful nod and turned to go. As she walked away, she didn't feel victorious. She felt something deeper. Not triumph, but transformation. A shift that didn't roar like a storm, but whispered like the first sign of spring beneath a long winter. Quiet, persistent, inevitable. She returned to Daniel, who greeted her with arms open wide and a gaze that had only grown more certain throughout the evening. Can I tell you something? He asked as she curled into his side. Always. I don't think I've ever loved you more than I do right now. She smiled, eyes glistening. That's funny. I was just thinking the same thing. They danced then, slowly, as the world around them blurred into golden lights and soft laughter. The crowd watched, but they didn't see anyone else. In each other's arms, they felt not just love, but safety. The kind of safety that comes not from approval, but from shared truth. Near the back of the room, Mrs. Whitmore had returned to her seat beside her husband. Her eyes were still puffy, but she no longer tried to hide it. She watched her son and daughter-in-law with a new kind of wonder. Not one born from admiration, but from something more painful and more necessary, regret. Mr. Whitmore leaned slightly toward her. We have a choice, he said quietly. She nodded. I know. They both looked back to the dance floor, and in that moment, the possibility of a new kind of legacy began to form. Not one etched in stone, but one rooted in grace. In growth. In a woman who dared to speak when silence was easier. And the music played on. The ballroom began to thin out as the evening wore on. Plates set scraped clean, champagne glasses half full and forgotten on tabletops, laughter still echoing faintly under the soft string lights. The DJ transitioned from slow ballads to nostalgic classics, ushering the crowd gently from reverence into relaxation. A few brave souls had already kicked off their heels and loosened their ties, floating to the dance floor like they belonged to the moment and nothing else. But Ayanna wasn't thinking about music or wine or cake anymore. She was watching from a small corner of the room, Daniel beside her, their hands interlocked beneath the linen-covered table. Their eyes swept across the space, both of them quiet, both still digesting everything that had happened, but in different ways. She was exhausted. Not from the day, not even from the emotional labor of navigating the Whitmore's quiet hostility all these months, but from the sheer release of what she had just done. Her words had lifted years off her chest. But carrying the aftermath was a different kind of weight, one that didn't wound but still demanded strength. The spotlight had shifted from admiration to scrutiny, from whispers of doubt to whispers of awe. And awe, Ayanna knew, could be just as dangerous as dismissal. Because people always expected the exceptional from those they once underestimated. Daniel reached for her cheek and ran his thumb along her jaw. Are you okay? He asked. She nodded. I am. I think. I'm just processing. You were brilliant, he said. I don't know how else to say it. Ayanna smiled, but her eyes remained steady on something across the room. Mrs. Whitmore was standing again, this time speaking to a group of guests near the edge of the hall. And not just speaking, but smiling, gesturing, conversing. Ayanna tilted her head, studying her. There was something softer in her now. She wasn't the woman Ayanna had first met at that uptown brunch, nor the one who delivered veiled judgments over family dinners. There was vulnerability there, or maybe exposure. The look of a person who had been cracked open just enough for light to begin slipping in. But what truly caught Ayanna's attention was what Mrs. Whitmore held in her hand, the scholarship folio. She had it tucked beneath her arm like a clutch, carefully wrapped in one hand as though it were delicate, breakable, important. She asked for it, Daniel said, noticing where Ayanna was looking. What? The paperwork, he said. After you stepped outside earlier. She came over. Didn't say much. Just asked me if she could have it. Said she wanted to read it again. Ayana stared, uncertain what to make of that. But she didn't need to decide just yet. Tonight wasn't about understanding everyone. It was about releasing what needed to be let go. Moments later, the DJ called for the family dance. It wasn't a part of the itinerary Ayana had cared much about. She'd only agreed to it to humor the planners, imagining it would be a chance for a few polite twirls with older relatives and a break before the final dance set. But what happened instead was something she hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Whitmore stepped forward. Daniel saw her first, rising cautiously from his chair. Ayana followed, heart caught in her throat. "May I?" Mrs. Whitmore asked, her voice low but sincere, extending a hand toward Ayana like someone offering not just a gesture, but an apology. The entire ballroom hushed again. The air trembled. People paused mid-step, forks frozen halfway to mouths. Ayana stood very still. There were 1,000 things she could have said. 1,000 words she could have summoned from the reservoir of things she'd swallowed over the years. But she looked at the older woman standing before her, not proud, not expectant, but hopeful, and she nodded. They stepped onto the dance floor together. The music began, something soft and bluesy. Not traditional, but soulful, intimate. The kind of music that doesn't demand performance, just presence. Ayana placed one hand gently in Mrs. Whitmore's, the other resting lightly on her shoulder. They moved slowly, uncertainly at first. But then gradually the rhythm found them. No words were spoken for the first minute. Just steps. Just breath. Just music. Then Mrs. Whitmore said, "I was wrong about you." Ayana didn't respond. "I let fear disguise itself as tradition. I told myself I was protecting my family. But what I was really doing was protecting my own comfort." Still, Ayana didn't reply. "Daniel is better with you. Stronger. More honest. And I see that now. I don't know if I can earn your forgiveness, but I want to try." Ayana's eyes glistened, not from pain, but from the complicated tangle of grace and grief. Because even when apologies arrive, they carry with them the echo of everything that came before. Still, she let herself nod. "Just once. I don't need you to be perfect," she said. "I just need you to be real." They danced in silence after that, but it wasn't heavy. It was tender, like a scar being acknowledged, not erased, but honored. As the song faded, the room erupted in applause again. But this time, it wasn't the kind born from performance. It was the kind that comes when people witness something bigger than themselves, something hopeful, healing, human. After the family dance ended, Daniel swept Ayana into one final spin on the floor, twirling her beneath a cascade of fairy lights. Their laughter danced with them, weightless, unburdened. Every eye in the room followed them now, not because of who they were or what lines had been crossed, but because of what they represented. Two people who had fought to be seen, to be heard, to be together. And then something else happened. Guests began coming forward, one by one, offering not just congratulations but commitments. A former classmate of Daniel's stepped up and offered to host a fundraiser for the scholarship fund. One of Ayana's medical colleagues promised to connect her with a national youth mentorship program. Even a retired senator who had known the Whitmore family for decades pulled her aside and said, "You just rewrote what legacy means." By the end of the night, it was no longer just a wedding. It was a movement. And as Ayana and Daniel stood at the center of it all, arms around each other, tired but glowing, they understood something deeper than love. They had built something. Not just a marriage, not just a moment, but a model for what happens when truth meets grace. When the past is confronted, not with vengeance but vision. When the courage of one becomes the courage of many. Outside, the stars had finally scattered across the sky. And Ayana, looking up at them, whispered to Daniel, "I think we're just getting started." He kissed her temple. "Yes," he said. "This is only the beginning." The ballroom was nearly empty now, the laughter and clinking glasses having faded into the lingering notes of the final song. The musicians were packing up, the floral arrangements slightly wilted at the edges from hours of celebration. Somewhere in the back, a sleepy child curled against her mother's shoulder. A waiter carried out the last tray of untouched hors d'oeuvres. It was the end of the evening, but not the end of what the evening had started. Ayana stood at the far side of the room, her hands resting on the ledge of an open window, cool night air drifting in to kiss her skin. She watched the garden below, where tiny strings of lights still glowed like fallen stars tangled in the hedges. The moon hung full above the lake, reflected in its still surface. The air was quieter here, clean, honest. Behind her, footsteps approached, measured and slow, but not hesitant. Daniel wrapped his arms around her waist and rested his chin on her shoulder, sighing deeply as if finally letting the weight of the day fall away. "You tired?" he asked. "Not tired. Just still." Her voice was soft, thoughtful. "It's like something cracked open tonight, and now the air feels different." Daniel kissed the side of her neck. "That's because you changed something. Not just in the room. In people. You took everything they used to believe about who deserves to belong, and rewrote it." Ayana leaned back into him. "I didn't rewrite it for them. I did it for us. And for all the people who'll never get the mic." They stood in silence for a while, just watching the night. The hum of a distant highway, the call of an owl, the faint rustling of trees. Everything felt like it was exhaling after holding its breath too long. Daniel turned her gently to face him. "You realize what you did tonight will ripple far beyond this family, right?" She nodded. "That was the hope. But also," he said, cupping her face with both hands, "you were just breathtaking. Fierce and beautiful and completely unstoppable." Ayana chuckled. "Don't make me blush at midnight. I've earned at least 1 hour of invincibility. Then let me say one more thing before your crown turns into a pumpkin." He leaned closer. "I love you, but I also respect the hell out of you." She closed her eyes, leaning into the words. Because love without respect is adoration at a distance. But love with respect? That was fire and foundation. Inside the hall, only a few people remained. Some family members lingered, reluctant to break the spell of the evening. Ayana's father was talking with Daniel's uncle, their voices low but animated, laughter erupting between stories. Her mother sat with Mrs. Whitmore now, not across the room, but beside her, close enough to speak without raising their voices. A slow reconciliation, maybe. Or maybe something simpler. Two women, mothers both, letting down their guard for the first time. Ayana and Daniel stepped back into the room, hand in hand. They didn't say much. There was nothing more that needed to be said. Instead, they simply moved among the remaining guests, exchanging soft goodbyes, receiving lingering hugs. Then Mrs. Whitmore rose to meet them. She was holding the scholarship folder again, but this time, she offered it directly to Ayana. "I finished reading it," she said, voice quiet, but steady. "Every page." Ayana took it, her fingers brushing lightly against the older woman's. And I want to add to it," Mrs. Whitmore said. "Not just money. Influence. My network. Access. If it's going to carry our name, then it should carry the full weight of what that name can do when used for something good." Daniel looked at his mother, surprised. But Ayana simply nodded. "Then help me turn it into something bigger than all of us." "I will," Mrs. Whitmore replied. "I've already made calls." They didn't hug. That wasn't the kind of moment this was. But they did share a look, a meeting of eyes that, for the first time, was neither guarded nor strained. There was no pretending anymore. No tests left to pass. Just a fragile understanding, new and raw, but real. As Ayana and Daniel stepped outside into the cool night, a soft breeze caught the edges of her veil, tugging it gently like a whisper from the wind. She laughed and pulled it loose, letting it fall away as they walked down the garden path. They didn't talk much as they walked, just the sound of their footsteps on gravel, the occasional chirp of night insects, the warmth of hands tightly clasped. At the edge of the lake, Ayana stopped. She turned toward Daniel and looked up at the moon. "I used to think," she began, "that the goal was to be accepted, to be welcomed into a space. But I've realized that acceptance isn't always the victory." Daniel tilted his head. "Then what is?" She looked at him, her eyes steady, glowing in the moonlight. "It's knowing you belong, even when others refuse to see it, and then building a world where no one has to question if they do." Daniel didn't respond with words. He simply kissed her, softly, then deeply, as if sealing something sacred between them. And when they pulled away, the moment didn't end. It unfolded, because what had started as a wedding had become something else entirely, a reclamation, a voice, of history, of future. The scholarship would become a national program within 2 years, drawing support from universities, private donors, and public figures who had heard about that wedding speech. Ayana would be invited to speak at conferences, on panels, to write op-eds. But she wouldn't do it for the attention. She would do it for the Ayana who once sat silently in that dining room, biting her tongue under crystal chandeliers. Mrs. Whitmore would join the board, not as a figurehead, but as a learner. She would listen more than she spoke. And each time someone tried to dismiss Ayana's work, she'd be the first to correct them. The Whitmore name would shift in meaning. not erased, but evolved. And Daniel, he would become not just her partner in life, but in change. They would build a clinic together. They would mentor students. They would raise children, each of whom would grow up knowing that love is not fragile, but forged. That silence is not golden, but expensive. And that grace, when wielded by truth, can tear down walls marble and centuries thick. On the night of their 10th anniversary, Ayana would return to this very lake. With Daniel, with their daughter, with a crowd gathered to celebrate the 1,000th recipient of the Whitmore Opportunity Scholarship. And she would tell the story, not of a perfect wedding, but of an imperfect world, and one woman who decided to stand in the middle of it, uninvited, and speak anyway. Because in the end, the question was never, do I belong in your world? The real question was always, do you deserve to be part of mine?